Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am in Edinburgh, outside the home of Robert Louis Stevenson. He was born here in this city in 1850, not in this house. They only moved here in 1857. So he was from a very well-to-do family. His father was a very distinguished civil engineer, as had both his grandfathers been, and there were notable physicians, Church of Scotland ministers, and such like in his ancestry. So he had everything a child could reasonably want. And look at the house, how tall it is, in one of the most desirable addresses in Edinburgh, Heriot Row, and it hadn't been built long before his birth. So the United Kingdom was on the up and up. And so he had a certain confidence and worldview that was shaped by his generation, by living at the zenith of the British Empire. However, he was a very sickly child. He suffered bronchitis amongst other ailments. So his schooling was desultory. He attended a number of schools in the city, one of them at India Street, which is not 5 minutes walk away, and sometimes at Edinburgh Academy, which is one of the most celebrated schools in the city and indeed the whole of Scotland. But he was taught at home by private tutors a lot. He didn't have his nose out of a book very much. He was always lean, sometimes cadaverous. He had lank, dark blonde hair, and in later life a moustache. He liked a few physical pursuits, and he wrote a book, I can't remember, it's called A Treasury of Children's Verse, something like that, and one of those about the joy of going up and down on a swing. And he briefly attended a boarding school in London, in Isleworth. But when he was an adolescent, he reflected that he was the despair of his parents and a bitter disappointment to them, and that wounded him deeply. Anyway, when he was 17, he enrolled at Edinburgh University, which has a fantastic reputation even to this day. There are very few universities back in those days, and it was world-renowned then. Anyway, he was to read engineering, but that didn't suit his tastes, and he made a great effort not to make an effort, but most of his energy into avoiding work. And so then he was allowed to switch to law, as he was a humanities type, suited him more. The idea of being called to the Faculty of Advocates, and everybody knows that he was blessed with the most splendid linguistic facility. Anyway, so he graduated from the University of Edinburgh, but he decided to be a writer. He travelled around France, he purchased a donkey with which to do so, and he wrote a travelogue, Travels on a Donkey. So he had flirted with socialism as an adolescent, and that was quite ahead of his time, not as en vogue as it was to later become. You remember, we're talking about 1867 at the time. He noted how the Irish Catholic community in Edinburgh were often socially marginal, living in Cowgate, and he said it was like looking in at a different world, because here he was from an upper middle class Protestant family with all the right connections. Anyhow, so he was very widely travelled. He travelled to the United States. He later met an American lady 10 years older than him. She was previously married, so he married her, and he had a stepson through her. They never had children of their own. He had Fanny, and he lived in Samoa in later life. So he was friends with many of the literary luminaries of the day, like Henley, who's more or less forgotten now, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, another native of Edinburgh, and quite a few more. Henley was missing one leg. He'd had to have it amputated because of some disease, I can't remember, but was an enormous and very muscular man. And he said this, this wounded mite inspired him to invent the character Long John Silver, pirate, the chef aboard the ship who had only one leg. Now, the pirate tale genre was at the height of its popularity in the late 19th century, because pirates had been largely cleared from the seas by the Royal Navy. And so when he was writing this in the 1870s, Robert Louis Stevenson was looking back a century earlier, or even more. And the locales are real. And remember, there's the Admiral Benbow Inn. It's set somewhere in southwest England, and Benbow really was an admiral. But and the actual locale where the treasure supposedly secreted is never disclosed. It's not far from the coast of Spanish America being Latin America back in the 18th century. He often wrote at a frenetic pace. His mind would be teeming with thoughts, and he spoke in pressured speech sometimes, just like when he wrote The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So that was obviously based on a true tale of William Brodie, a well-known Edinburgh character of the 18th century, lived on the Royal Mile. William Brodie, who was involved in a guild, That he was deacon of that, not as in an assistant to a priest, elected to the city council, but was a pillar of the community by day, but by night would don a disguise, go out and wreak havoc, burglarizing other places, burgling them, because he had keys as a locksmith to the houses of the great and the good. So Jekyll and Hyde is that same sort of split personality, and he may well have written this under the influence of drugs like opium. And his wife became his literary partner. Not that she was an authoress, but she read and critiqued his work and gave him plenty of ideas for his drafts. So he often wrote them in just a few days. So that one, Kidnapped, when he wrote an adventure story set in 1745, the time of the Jacobite Rebellion, and the action takes place in three continents, America, Europe, and Asia, particularly India. And his novels have a pace to them, are exceptionally vivid, and the characterization is fabulous. The characters are always very well fleshed out. So they still might seem a little bit turgid these days. Now, he moved to Samoa, hoping it would be a better climate for his health, but unfortunately he succumbed to his illness and died in 1894. So he's buried there, and his epitaph is from a poem that he wrote: "Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter, home from the hill." So he's an absolutely fascinating character who roved the world and who left his mark on world literature. Through the 20th century, he was seen to be a bit trite, suitable only for children. This wasn't considered intellectually worthy literature. Perhaps his reputation has come up in the world since, but he certainly spins a yarn, and he was also said to be a fantastic raconteur in person. So there have been so many iterations of Treasure Island as a film. Can't go wrong with a plot line like that. So there is his house. It's a private house. You can see people having dinner in there. A number of other locations in Edinburgh still stand, including things built by his grandfather and his father. And his grandfather built most of the lighthouses in Scotland. And indeed, Robert Louis Stevenson took great pride in visiting them. I think I should actually pronounce it Louis Stevenson, because originally it's spelled Lewis, but he changed the spelling to Louis. Now, Louis in British is usually pronounced Louis, as in the French way, but because his name was originally Lews, I suppose I should pronounce it Louis. Robert Louis Stevenson or Robert Louis Stevenson. He's usually known by all three names, not just Stevenson, and never Robert Stevenson. Although growing up he was just known as Robert Stevenson. Only in adult life did he insist, no, I want to be known by all three names. And that is Robert Louis Stevenson.